Minutes before takeoff, on a private airfield outside the city, the pilot of a $200 million Gulfstream received an order that froze every crew member on board. Stella Langford, chief executive of Aurelius Aerospace, had just been told that a device containing classified flight data had vanished from a locked briefcase. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Within seconds, every door on the aircraft sealed shut. Every passenger was told to remain seated, and a silence fell over the cabin that felt heavier than the engines outside. Board members exchanged glances. Investors reached instinctively for their own bags, as if to prove their innocence before being asked. And at the very back of the plane, the last passenger to be searched sat quietly, a canvas bag resting between his worn boots, waiting his turn without a trace of worry on his face. His name was Nathan Carter, and nobody on that aircraft truly knew who he was. He wore a faded jacket that had clearly survived more winters than anyone else's tailored suit, and his shoes showed the soft creases of a man who walked more than he sat behind a desk. When Stella finally reached him, she did not ask questions. She simply extended her hand toward the bag, the way a customs officer might reach for contraband. Certain of what she would find, the cabin went still. Executives leaned forward. Somewhere near the front, a young analyst whispered that this was the man who must have taken it, simply because he did not belong among them. Nathan said nothing. He only nodded once and placed the bag gently on the table between them, as though he had been expecting this moment long before it arrived. Stella unzipped it slowly, her manicured fingers moving with the same precision she used to dismantle underperforming departments. There was no hard drive inside, no stolen files, nothing that matched the missing device at all. Instead, her hand closed around something colder, heavier, and far older than anything she expected to find in a stranger's travel bag. It was a small metal box, dented at the corners, its hinges rusted from years of handling. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as she lifted the lid, because whatever sat inside that box was about to change the way every person in that plane understood the man sitting quietly before them. When the lid finally opened, Stella's expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to disbelief. And the silence that followed was unlike anything the aircraft had ever carried at 40,000 feet. Before the search, before the accusations, and before the metal box ever left the shadow of that canvas bag, the morning had begun like any other high-stakes departure for Aurelius Aerospace. Ground crews moved briskly across the tarmac. Catering staff loaded polished trays through the rear galley, and a line of black cars delivered executives who checked their phones more often than they checked the sky above them. Stella had arrived first, as she always did, walking the length of the aircraft with a tablet in hand, reviewing seating arrangements and contract summaries with the same intensity she brought to every decision that mattered. She had rehearsed the flight's itinerary a dozen times in her mind, anticipating questions from investors and preparing counterarguments for partners who might hesitate over the final terms. Nothing about that morning suggested the day would end with her standing in front of an entire cabin, admitting she had been wrong about a man she barely knew. To understand how a chief executive and a stranger in a faded jacket ended up staring at each other over an open metal box, it helps to understand the two very different worlds each of them came from. Stella Langford had built her career on precision, discipline, and an almost mathematical refusal to make mistakes. She ran a company of more than 40,000 employees, and the financial press had taken to calling her the woman who never got it wrong, a title she wore the way other executives wore expensive watches. Quietly, but never without pride. She believed in structure above sentiment. She believed that trust was not given but earned through performance, contracts, and results that could be measured on a spreadsheet. To Stella, appearances were rarely irrelevant, because in her world, appearances often signaled competence, and competence was the only currency she respected. Nathan Carter belonged to an entirely different world, one that rarely appeared in boardrooms or press releases. He was an independent aviation engineer, the kind of specialist companies called only when their own experts had already failed. He never accepted permanent positions, never wore a title on a business card, and never seemed interested in climbing any corporate ladder that others spent their lives fighting for. His reputation existed almost entirely by word of mouth, passed quietly between chief engineers who had watched him solve problems that manuals could not explain. Colleagues who had worked beside him described a man who treated every aircraft, regardless of size or value, with the same careful respect, as though the machine itself deserved patience rather than shortcuts. He had turned down offers from larger firms more than once, preferring the freedom to choose which problems were worth his time rather than which paycheck offered the largest number. Those who knew him well understood that his quiet manner concealed a discipline few people ever matched. A discipline built not in classrooms, but in the long, unglamorous hours spent underneath engines that other specialists had already given up on. He carried the same canvas bag to every job, filled with tools that had clearly been used for decades rather than displayed for show. To most people who saw him for the first time, he looked less like an expert and more like a man who fixed refrigerators for a living. A misconception that had followed him for years without ever seeming to bother him. The flight that brought them together was no ordinary trip. It carried shareholders, strategic partners, and investors whose signatures would determine whether Aurelius Aerospace secured a contract worth several $billion. Every seat on that aircraft represented influence, capital, and reputation. And Stella had spent months preparing for this single flight, as though it were the most important presentation of her career. Everything had been arranged with surgical precision, from the seating chart to the temperature of the cabin, because Stella did not believe in leaving anything to chance. And then, less than an hour before departure, the auxiliary electrical system triggered an alert that none of the onboard engineers could explain, a small crack in an otherwise flawless plan that Stella refused to ignore. Her own technical team spent nearly 30 minutes staring at diagnostic screens without finding a single answer, their confidence eroding with every passing minute. Frustrated and increasingly aware of the clock ticking toward departure, Stella made a call she rarely liked making, reaching outside her own company for help. Someone on her staff mentioned a freelance engineer who occasionally consulted for smaller charter companies. A man known simply as Carter, who apparently had a reputation for solving problems that defeated everyone else. Reluctantly, and only because time had run out, Stella agreed to bring him aboard. She had no idea, in that moment, that she was about to invite the very man who once saved her company from collapse without ever knowing his name. When Nathan finally stepped onto the aircraft, he looked at the flashing warning lights on the control panel for barely 2 minutes before speaking. His voice was calm, almost too calm for the tension surrounding him. And what he said unsettled Stella more than the alert itself had. He told her that the error blinking across the screen was not the real problem at all, but merely a symptom of something deeper hiding beneath the surface. Stella studied him carefully, unsure whether she was looking at brilliance or bluff, because nothing about his tone matched the confidence of his claim. Around them, executives in tailored suits watched the exchange with quiet skepticism, already forming opinions about the man in the worn jacket. None of them yet understood that his simple sentence was about to set the entire story in motion. A senior director, named Marcus Whitfield, seated near the front with a folder of contract documents balanced on his knee, leaned toward a colleague and muttered that they had wasted precious time bringing in an outsider when the company's own engineers were more than capable. His colleague nodded in quiet agreement, neither of them aware that the man they dismissed so casually had already spent a decade proving his worth to the very company they now represented. Stella overheard none of it, her attention fixed entirely on Nathan and the calm certainty in his voice, though the murmurs circulating behind her would soon grow louder as the flight's troubles deepened. Every person aboard that aircraft wore a suit pressed sharp enough to cut paper, except for the man who had just walked up the boarding stairs carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. Nathan moved through the cabin without hesitation, his eyes scanning wiring panels and instrument displays rather than the faces staring at him. A few shareholders leaned toward each other, whispering questions about who exactly had been allowed onto a flight worth billions of dollars in potential deals. One young executive murmured that he looked more like a maintenance worker who had wandered onto the wrong plane than any kind of specialist. Nathan heard the comment clearly, yet his expression never changed, and he continued working as though the whispers around him belonged to a different conversation entirely. Stella watched him with the same analytical detachment she used when evaluating underperforming assets. She noted the frayed straps of his bag, the worn leather gloves tucked into his pocket, and the small paper notebook he pulled out instead of a tablet or laptop. Everything about him contradicted the polished image she associated with technical excellence, and for a moment she wondered whether her staff had made an embarrassing mistake in hiring him. In her mind, competence wore a certain uniform, and Nathan Carter did not fit into it. She told herself that appearances rarely lied, a belief that had served her well throughout her career, yet something about the quiet confidence in his movements refused to match her assumptions. One flight attendant, a young woman named Danielle Reyes who had worked aboard Aurelius aircraft for nearly 3 years, watched Nathan work with quiet curiosity rather than judgment. She had seen countless consultants pass through that cabin, most of them eager to announce their credentials before they had even removed their coats. Nathan did neither, moving instead with the unhurried focus of someone who cared more about the work itself than the impression he left behind. She offered him a glass of water at one point, and he thanked her with a warmth that seemed to surprise her, as though kindness from a passenger were something she rarely expected on flights filled with impatient executives. It was a small moment, unnoticed by nearly everyone else in the cabin, yet it would later become one of the few details Danielle remembered clearly when she described that flight to her own family. Nathan continued his inspection, tracing wiring bundles with steady fingers and jotting brief notes in pencil rather than ink. Within minutes, he identified several irregularities that the onboard engineering team had completely overlooked, small details that suggested a deeper fault buried beneath layers of newer equipment. He opened his mouth to explain his findings to the lead engineer standing nearby, ready to walk them through what he had discovered. Before a single word left his lips, a sharp announcement cut through the cabin, freezing every conversation mid-sentence. A member of the security team reported that the encrypted storage device containing sensitive flight and financial data had disappeared from the executive briefcase where it had been locked only an hour earlier. The calm atmosphere of preparation shattered instantly, replaced by a tension that seemed to compress the very air inside the aircraft. Within moments, the entire cabin transformed into something closer to a courtroom than a private jet. Stella ordered every exterior door sealed immediately, her voice sharp enough to silence even the loudest investor mid-conversation. She demanded access to internal security footage, insisted that no one be permitted to leave their seat, and instructed her staff to prepare for a full search of every bag on board. The temperature in the cabin seemed to rise despite the steady hum of climate control, as passengers who, moments earlier, had been discussing billion-dollar contracts, now eyed each other with quiet suspicion. Papers rustled nervously. Phones were checked and rechecked as though the missing device might somehow reappear through sheer anxious repetition. It did not take long before eyes began drifting toward the back of the aircraft, toward the one passenger whose presence had never quite fit the polished world surrounding him. Someone pointed out, in a voice just loud enough to carry, that Nathan had boarded only minutes before the device disappeared, and that his oversized bag had never been properly inspected. Another executive added, almost too eagerly, that a man like that had no real business being trusted around confidential corporate data in the first place. The accusations were never stated outright, yet the implication hung in the recycled cabin air, as clearly as if it had been printed on a boarding pass. Nathan remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression revealing neither anger nor fear at the sudden weight of suspicion settling onto his shoulders. When Stella finally turned to face him directly, Nathan did not argue, did not protest, and did not demand an explanation for why he alone had become the center of attention. He simply looked at her with the same steady calm he had carried since stepping onto the plane, and told her that if searching his belongings would help ease the tension in the cabin, she was welcome to do exactly that. His willingness seemed to catch Stella off guard, as though she had expected resistance, and instead received quiet cooperation. For a brief moment, something flickered across her expression, an emotion closer to curiosity than suspicion, though she buried it quickly beneath her usual composure. She straightened her shoulders, glanced once at her security team, and made a decision that would soon reshape everything she believed about the man sitting before her. Rather than delegate the task, she announced that she would personally search the bag herself, in full view of every passenger seated around them. The announcement rippled through the cabin like a current, drawing every remaining eye toward the small table where Nathan's canvas bag now sat. Stella approached it with the same deliberate control she brought to hostile takeovers, unwilling to let anyone see even a flicker of hesitation. Security personnel stepped back to give her room, while shareholders leaned forward in their seats, sensing that whatever happened next would define the tone of the entire flight. Nathan remained silent, watching not with anxiety but with something closer to quiet patience, as though he had lived through moments like this before and knew exactly how they tended to end. The overhead lighting caught the worn stitching along the bag's edges, evidence of years spent traveling from one aircraft to another. Stella unzipped the main compartment slowly, fully expecting to find something that would justify the suspicion now surrounding him. Instead, item after item emerged that belonged to a craftsman rather than a corporate spy. There was a well-worn screwdriver set, its handles smoothed from years of steady use, followed by a compact multimeter with cracked but functional casing. A small wrench, a pair of scratched safety goggles, and a thick notebook filled with handwritten diagrams came next, each page dense with technical sketches that clearly took years to accumulate. Nothing inside the bag resembled anything valuable enough to justify a corporate heist, let alone the theft of classified data. Somewhere near the middle of the cabin, a quiet laugh broke the tension, followed by a murmured comment that the man truly was nothing more than a mechanic after all. The remark stung with quiet condescension. Yet Nathan's expression remained unreadable, as though the judgment of strangers had long ago stopped mattering to him. Stella continued searching, her fingers brushing against something colder and heavier resting at the very bottom of the bag. She lifted out a small metal box, its surface dulled by age, its corners dented from what appeared to be decades of careful handling. The cabin fell silent again, curiosity overtaking suspicion, as every passenger leaned forward to see what could possibly be hidden inside something so plain and unassuming. Stella hesitated for the briefest moment, her instincts telling her this object mattered more than anything else she had uncovered so far. She unfastened the small latch, lifted the lid, and found herself staring at a collection of items that seemed strikingly out of place inside a stranger's travel bag. Nestled carefully within the box lay a tarnished medal, a folded letter yellowed with time, and an old identification badge bearing a company crest Stella recognized instantly as her own. Her eyes moved to the signature at the bottom of the letter, and for a long moment, she forgot entirely about the missing device that had triggered this search in the first place. The name written in fading ink belonged to someone whose legacy still shaped every decision made within Aurelius Aerospace, someone whose portrait hung in the very boardroom where Stella had signed her first major contract. It was the founder of the company himself, a man who had passed away years earlier, yet whose influence still echoed through every policy the corporation upheld. Stella's hands tightened slightly around the letter as she began reading the words written across its faded surface, words that described gratitude towards someone whose contribution had once saved the entire company from collapse. The cabin around her seemed to fade into background noise as she processed what she was holding, because the name mentioned throughout that letter matched the very man sitting quietly across from her. The letter, written more than a decade earlier, described in careful detail how Nathan Carter had single-handedly prevented the failure of a project known internally as Sky Shield, a program considered so critical that its collapse would have bankrupted the company entirely. According to the founder's own words, Nathan had identified a catastrophic design flaw that every senior engineer on staff had somehow missed, a flaw that would have grounded an entire fleet and destroyed billions of dollars in pending contracts. He had corrected the issue quietly, without asking for recognition, compensation, or any form of public acknowledgement. The letter praised his integrity as much as his skill, noting that few engineers in the industry possessed both in equal measure. Stella read the words twice, her composure slipping slightly, as she realized the man she had just publicly suspected of theft was the very person responsible for the survival of everything she now controlled. Memory pulled at Stella as she stared at the worn signature, though what followed existed only in the accounts passed down through company legend rather than anything she had witnessed herself. Engineers who worked during that era still spoke, in hushed tones, about the night an outside consultant arrived unannounced and spent nearly 20 hours tracing a single anomaly through thousands of pages of technical schematics. He had found the flaw buried deep within a secondary support structure, a defect invisible to standard testing procedures, yet catastrophic under specific flight conditions. Rather than escalate the discovery through official channels, he corrected it himself, working through the night, with borrowed tools, and no formal authorization. When executives later offered him a permanent position, generous compensation, and even partial ownership stakes in gratitude, he declined every single offer without hesitation. His only response, according to those who remembered it, was that the safety of the aircraft mattered more than any reward he could receive for protecting it. Before Stella could fully process the weight of what she had just discovered, a piercing alarm shattered the stillness of the cabin, cutting through every remaining conversation instantly. This was not the minor electrical warning that had delayed their departure earlier. This alert carried a different urgency altogether, one that caused the pilot's voice to crack slightly as it came through the intercom system. The primary flight control system had triggered a critical failure warning, and neither the pilot nor the onboard technical staff could identify its source. Panic rippled through the cabin as passengers who moments earlier had been whispering judgments about a stranger's worn jacket now clutched their armrests in genuine fear. Stella turned instinctively toward the only person aboard who had already proven, through a decade-old letter, that he understood this aircraft better than anyone else present. The internal engineering team scrambled toward the cockpit, their fingers moving frantically across diagnostic terminals that offered no clear answers. The lead engineer, sweat forming along his brow, admitted openly that he could not determine the cause of the failure, a confession that sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the surrounding passengers. Nathan rose from his seat without hesitation, moving toward the front of the aircraft with the same unhurried calm he had carried since boarding. He studied the flashing readouts for a moment, his expression sharpening with focused concentration rather than fear. This was, he explained quietly, an extremely rare failure pattern, one that most engineers would never encounter across an entire career. If the aircraft attempted takeoff under these conditions, there was a genuine risk of losing critical control functions mid-flight, a possibility that turned every remaining conversation in the cabin into stunned silence. For the first time since boarding, Stella addressed him not with suspicion but with something closer to genuine respect, asking him plainly what he needed to resolve the situation. Nathan answered simply that he needed 10 minutes and full access to the control panel housing the flight computer. Stella nodded once, turned to her security team, and ordered them to give him whatever access he required, without delay or hesitation. The transformation in her tone did not go unnoticed by the passengers watching closely, many of whom had mocked his appearance only minutes earlier. Nathan knelt beside the panel, removed a small set of tools from his worn bag, and began working with the same steady precision that had once saved this very company from ruin. The cabin fell into a tense, watchful silence as he carefully unscrewed the housing and began tracing wires with practiced, unhurried hands. Nathan worked with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural given the urgency surrounding him, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had performed this exact motion countless times before. No one in the cabin dared speak, afraid that even a single interruption might break his concentration at the worst possible moment. Within minutes, he located a component buried deep within a secondary circuit board that had failed in a way modern diagnostic software simply was not designed to detect. It was the kind of flaw that revealed itself only through years of hands-on experience, the sort of knowledge that could never be replicated by an algorithm or a checklist. As he worked, he began explaining each step aloud, not for dramatic effect, but because two of the company's own engineers had crouched beside him, eager to understand what they had missed. For the first time since boarding, nobody in that cabin viewed him as an outsider who did not belong among them. The minutes stretched painfully as Nathan continued his repair, his voice remaining calm, even as tension thickened around him with every passing second. He explained that certain failures could not be predicted by software because they existed in the space between mechanical wear and electrical timing, a space only experience could truly map. The two engineers beside him nodded, taking notes despite the circumstances, absorbing knowledge they would likely carry with them for the rest of their careers. Stella stood a short distance away, watching the exchange with an expression that had shifted entirely from suspicion to quiet astonishment. When the allotted 10 minutes finally passed, Nathan reconnected the final wire, closed the panel, and instructed the pilot to restart the primary system. One of the two engineers kneeling beside him, a younger man named Ethan Brooks, who had joined the company only 2 years earlier, admitted quietly that he had never seen a failure diagnosed that quickly without the assistance of full diagnostic software. Nathan told him, without a trace of arrogance, that software could only ever tell a technician what it had already been programmed to recognize, and that real understanding came from years of watching systems fail in ways no manual anticipated. Ethan nodded slowly, tucking the lesson away with the same seriousness he might have given a warning about a genuine safety hazard. The cabin held its collective breath as the control panel flickered back to life, every indicator light returning to a steady, reassuring green. Relief swept through the aircraft almost audibly, passengers exhaling breaths they had not realized they were holding, a few even applauding softly at the sight of the restored systems. Yet Nathan did not step away from the panel immediately, nor did he offer the reassurance everyone expected him to provide. Instead, he remained crouched beside the control housing, his brow furrowed slightly, as though something still bothered him beneath the surface of the resolved crisis. Stella noticed his hesitation immediately, her earlier relief giving way once again to quiet concern. She asked him directly whether the aircraft was now safe to depart, expecting a simple confirmation in response. Nathan looked up at her, his expression unreadable, and told her that before they proceeded any further, there was still one unresolved matter that needed attention, something unrelated to the mechanical failure they had just repaired. Nathan asked quietly whether anyone had located the missing storage device, the very object that had triggered the search which led to his own bag being opened in front of the entire cabin. Stella hesitated, realizing in that moment that the crisis surrounding the flight controls had completely overshadowed the original incident. She turned to her security chief, who admitted with visible embarrassment that no further investigation had taken place since the alarm interrupted their search. Nathan suggested, calmly and without accusation, that perhaps the device had never actually been stolen at all, but simply misplaced amid the chaos of last-minute preparations. His words carried no judgment, yet they landed with quiet weight across the cabin, prompting several executives to instinctively check their own belongings once more. Within minutes, one of the senior directors, a man who had been among the loudest voices casting suspicion earlier, opened his own briefcase and froze completely still. Tucked between a stack of contract documents, exactly where it had been accidentally placed during the frantic preparations before boarding, sat the missing storage device. The director's face drained of color as he lifted it slowly, the weight of his earlier accusations settling over him with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. He had grabbed it along with his own files during the rush to finalize paperwork, never noticing the mistake until this very moment. The cabin fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence, the kind that follows the collapse of an assumption everyone had been so eager to believe. Every eye in the aircraft slowly shifted away from the director and toward the man they had wrongly suspected from the very beginning. Nathan said nothing, his expression calm, though something in his eyes suggested this was not the first time his character had been questioned before the truth was allowed to surface. Marcus Whitfield, the very director who had dismissed him hours earlier as an unnecessary outsider, stood frozen with the device still in his hand, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around him. He offered a stammered explanation about the chaos of last-minute packing, though no one in the cabin seemed particularly interested in hearing it. Danielle, still moving quietly between rows with a water pitcher in hand, glanced toward Nathan with an expression that carried quiet vindication, as though she had known all along that the accusations directed at him were built on nothing more than appearances. Stella stood motionless near the front of the cabin, the folded letter from her company's founder still resting in her hand, its faded ink suddenly carrying more weight than she had expected. She understood, in that moment, that the only person who had been publicly humiliated throughout the entire ordeal was the one man who had done nothing wrong at any point. He had been searched without cause, mocked for his appearance, suspected without evidence, and yet he had spent the last hour saving the very aircraft that carried his accusers. The realization settled over her slowly, replacing her usual composure with something closer to genuine discomfort. She glanced around the cabin, watching as shareholders and executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet Nathan's eyes now that the truth had fully surfaced. Stella took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and rose from her seat, aware that what she said next would matter far more than any contract waiting to be signed. She walked toward the front of the cabin, positioning herself where every passenger could see and hear her clearly, unwilling to offer a quiet apology that only Nathan would witness. Her voice, usually sharp and unwavering, carried a rare softness as she addressed the entire aircraft rather than a single individual. She admitted openly that she had judged a man based entirely on his appearance, allowing assumptions about status and image to override the evidence sitting quietly in front of her. It was, she said, the exact mistake she had always warned her own leadership team never to make, and yet she had made it herself in front of the very people she was trying to secure as partners. The cabin remained silent, shareholders and directors alike absorbing the rare sight of their unyielding chief executive acknowledging fault so publicly. Stella turned toward Nathan directly, her expression stripped of the guarded confidence she usually carried into every room. She told him plainly that the company owed him more than a simple apology, though she intended to offer that, first and foremost, sincerely and without conditions attached. Beyond the apology, she explained, Aurelius Aerospace wanted to formally recognize the debt it had carried silently for over a decade. A debt few within the company even remembered existed. She proposed, in front of the entire cabin, that Nathan accept a newly created position as Chief Technical Advisor, complete with substantial compensation, equity in the company, and full authority over engineering standards across every division. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary offer, the kind most professionals would accept without a moment's hesitation. Nathan listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than eager, giving no immediate indication of his answer. The cabin waited in suspended silence, aware that his response would carry as much significance as anything that had happened since the flight was delayed. After a long pause, Nathan finally spoke, his voice steady and without any trace of bitterness toward the suspicion he had endured only hours earlier. He told Stella that he appreciated the offer, and that he understood the weight behind it, yet titles and equity had never been what motivated him throughout his career. If she truly wanted to make things right, he said, there was only one condition he cared about, one that had nothing to do with his own compensation or position within the company. Stella studied him closely, aware that whatever he was about to request would reveal far more about his character than any letter from her company's founder ever could. The cabin leaned in collectively, shareholders and executives alike curious to hear what a man who had just been offered wealth and authority could possibly want instead. Nathan met Stella's gaze directly, his expression calm but resolute, and told her that his condition was simple, though it would require more effort from her company than any contract they had ever signed. He explained that he did not want a corner office, nor did he particularly want his name attached to a title that separated him from the very engineers he had spent his career working alongside. What he wanted, he said, was a genuine shift in how the company treated the people within it, starting with the assumptions made about someone before their actual abilities were ever considered. He described, without anger, how many talented individuals throughout his career had been dismissed or overlooked simply because their appearance did not match someone else's expectation of competence. He asked that no employee within Aurelius Aerospace ever again be judged by the condition of their jacket, the age of their shoes, or the simplicity of the bag they carried onto a company aircraft. Every person, he said, deserved to be evaluated by the quality of their work and the integrity of their character, nothing more and nothing less. Stella listened without interrupting, the weight of his words settling over her more heavily than any financial figure discussed earlier that day. Stella agreed immediately, without negotiation or hesitation, recognizing that his request cost the company nothing in dollars, yet demanded something far more difficult to change. She announced, right there in the cabin, that Aurelius Aerospace would implement a company-wide evaluation program built entirely around demonstrated skill and measurable performance rather than appearance or personal background. Every member of leadership, she declared, would be required to complete training focused on recognizing unconscious bias, ensuring that no employee would ever again face the kind of unfounded suspicion Nathan had endured that day. The announcement drew quiet nods from several executives who had spoken carelessly earlier, their earlier judgments now sitting uncomfortably in the front of their minds. Nathan accepted the advisory position under those conditions, though he made clear that his lifestyle would remain unchanged, regardless of his new title or compensation. He would continue arriving at every job site in the same simple clothing, the same worn boots, and the same faded canvas bag that had once been mistaken for evidence of wrongdoing. That same bag, along with the tools resting inside it, became something of a quiet symbol throughout the company in the months that followed. A reminder carried deliberately, rather than out of necessity. Nathan never replaced it with anything newer or more polished, even after his position within the company changed entirely. He continued using the same screwdrivers, the same worn notebook, and the same scratched safety goggles that had once drawn mocking laughter from strangers who assumed too much about him. Junior engineers who once might have overlooked him now sought him out specifically, eager to learn from someone whose expertise had nothing to do with the title printed on his employee badge. Stella herself referenced the incident more than once during leadership meetings, using it as a reminder that competence rarely announced itself through appearance alone. The story of the canvas bag spread quietly through the company, less as gossip and more as a lesson that seemed to settle differently with each person who heard it. When the aircraft finally lifted off the runway that evening, delayed by hours yet finally airborne, the cabin carried an atmosphere entirely different from the tense silence that had defined it earlier. Passengers who had whispered suspicion just hours before now applauded softly as the wheels left the ground, the sound rippling naturally through rows of seats that had recently sat in uncomfortable silence. Stella glanced toward Nathan, who sat quietly near the window, his canvas bag resting beneath his seat, exactly where it had been from the very beginning. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile, an expression rarely seen by anyone outside her closest circle of advisors. Leaning slightly toward him, she admitted quietly that she had learned something that day far more valuable than any contract signed during the flight ahead. She told him that she had not simply learned how to repair a failing aircraft system, but had learned, more importantly, how to see a person clearly for the first time. Nathan offered no dramatic response, only a small nod and a faint smile that suggested he had heard similar realizations before. Though rarely spoken so openly, he looked out toward the darkening sky beyond the window, the city lights beginning to scatter beneath them as the aircraft climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude. Somewhere far below, in a life entirely separate from boardrooms and corporate jets, he had responsibilities that had nothing to do with titles or public recognition, responsibilities that had shaped his quiet, deliberate approach to everything he did. He had spent years building a life defined by steady reliability, rather than status, choosing depth of character over the trappings of success that so many others chased without question. The company he now advised had once come dangerously close to losing everything, saved only by a stranger nobody thought to trust. And in the end, it was not wealth, nor title, nor recognition that defined his worth, but the quiet integrity he carried in a worn canvas bag that no one had bothered to understand until it was almost too late. The story that unfolded aboard that aircraft eventually became something larger than the flight itself, repeated in leadership seminars and quoted, in simplified form, during onboarding sessions for new employees across the company. It served as a reminder that judgment formed too quickly, based on surface impressions alone, often said more about the person judging than the person being judged. Executives who once prided themselves on reading people accurately began to second-guess assumptions they had never previously questioned. A small but meaningful shift within a culture once obsessed with image. Shareholders who had witnessed the entire event firsthand spoke of it in hushed, respectful tones whenever the topic of company values arose in later meetings. Nathan himself rarely brought up the incident, preferring instead to let his ongoing work speak for itself, just as it always had before that fateful flight. Yet those who worked closely with him understood, without needing to be told, that his quiet presence carried more weight within the company than any title ever could. Years later, When new employees asked about the origins of the company's now well-known commitment to fairness and merit-based evaluation, longtime staff members would often mention, briefly and without embellishment, the day a canvas bag was searched in front of an entire cabin of shareholders. They rarely explained the full story in detail, allowing the lesson to remain simple rather than dramatized, much like the man at the center of it had always preferred. Stella continued leading Aurelius Aerospace with the same discipline and precision she always had, though those closest to her noticed a subtle shift in how she evaluated new hires and partners alike. She began asking different questions during interviews, questions focused less on polish and more on substance, on proven ability rather than surface presentation. The lesson she had learned at 40,000 feet stayed with her long after that particular flight landed safely, shaping decisions she made for years afterward. And somewhere within the company's evolving culture, a quiet, steady man continued his work exactly as he always had. Unmoved by recognition, uninterested in status, carrying the same worn bag that had once, briefly, silenced an entire aircraft. Danielle Reyes still worked the same aircraft years later, and she often told newer crew members about the night a canvas bag changed the way an entire company thought about the people who kept it running. She never dramatized the story, choosing instead to describe it plainly, the way Nathan himself might have told it if anyone had ever asked him directly. Ethan Brooks, the young engineer who had knelt beside Nathan during those tense 10 minutes, went on to lead his own diagnostic team, and he still carried a pencil and paper notebook in his own bag. A habit he credited entirely to that single flight. Marcus Whitfield, humbled by his own mistake, became one of the loudest advocates within the company for the very evaluation program Nathan had requested, determined never to repeat the misjudgment that had once nearly cost the company its most valuable ally. None of them ever forgot the lesson that flight had taught them, a lesson far simpler than any contract or corporate strategy, yet far harder to practice consistently. A person's worth was never written on the surface of a jacket or the condition of a bag, but carried quietly within the work of their hands and the integrity of their choices.